Okay. Okay. I'll go to hell for you. He said with a heavy heart, but he meant it, and she knew he meant it. Tears in his eyes, fear shaking his body. This was the only way. It hadn't always been this way, of course. They had met in church. She was in the choir singing like an angel, which is the first clever thing that he said to her. Well, clever might be an over exaggeration. I mean, it's a pretty standard line to say you sing like an angel. But he thought it was clever and he tried to ask her out. And she said no and left. But he didn't give up. He wrote her notes and left them on her music stand. Simple notes. What he had done that day, what he was thinking about, what he had eaten, what he liked to eat, didn't like to eat, what he hoped for in the future, what he feared for in the future, adversities he had dealt with and overcome. And over time, eventually, she started responding to these notes with notes of her own, put on the pew that he would always sit on. This went on and on for a few weeks, and finally he asked her for her address so that they wouldn't bother anyone else. She gave him her address, he gave her his, and they wrote. And they did this for quite some time, over a year. Simple things, back and forth, nothing intimate, nothing about dates or romance or just what they were doing that day, what they had done or wanted to do, and complaints and grumbles and stresses. And finally, he asked her out again. And she said no. Well, she wrote no. He asked if they could meet in person. They hadn't seen each other for a while, as he had moved away to seminary and she had moved away to college. She said, sure, I guess. So they had met, and they talked and laughed and joked, and he asked her out again. She rolled her eyes at him. I don't want to get married and have kids. I'm happy doing what I'm doing. I'm learning about science, and I'm going to be entering a interesting field. This is what I want in my life. And he said, before you get us married and having kids, why don't we just go out and see what happens? He smirked at her and said, I promise I won't marry you and make you pregnant on the first date. Then she laughed and agreed. That was the first of many dates that they had. They'd see each other whenever possible, and sometimes by phone, sometimes in person, sometimes by the internet, but they found ways. Finally, she was done with college and he was done with seminary. And, well, they had moved in together. Well, he wanted her to marry him because the church might see it as a sin, but she had convinced him no to marriage. Fine. They were together and they were happy. Meanwhile, his career took off. He wrote poems, painted paintings. He wrote short stories, all about God. He was a spokesperson for his God, his religion. He was quite famous and was asked on to many different interview shows, many different news programs. For her career was skyrocketing. She was the foremost expert in her field of scientific research. Several peer-reviewed papers. And that was a problem for her because she noticed something in her work. At no point was there anything to be found to hint at God. Where was God? She looked through the most powerful microscopes at the inner workings of all the things that were at her disposal to tinker with and saw more things, amazing molecules, atoms, and chemicals, and a wide array of, well, one could say miraculous things. But no God. No God was needed to explain why these things behaved the way they behaved and how they behaved, and that was troublesome for her. It weighed on her deeply every day. She'd go in, she'd do her work, she'd look for God. She'd talk to her colleagues sometimes, quietly, worrying that it might mess her career up. But they didn't believe in God. No, almost no one did in her chosen career. The only person in her life that believed in God was her loving husband. Oh, by the way, she had finally married him. For his sake, mostly. But also, it made the taxes easier to deal with. So it was practical. But she swore no kids. That was okay with him. He was too busy being invited everywhere to speak. He proclaimed God from literal tops of mountains. His most famous speech being at the top of Mount Everest, wrapped in layers and layers of thick clothing as he sputtered out some sermon about God. Of course, he'd had lots of help to get to the top, but they didn't tell about that part. She knew, and he knew, and it wasn't important. Those who wanted to know would know. It's not like they had said that he'd went up there on his own or anything. Anyways, she slowly was coming to a realization that frightened her. On her drive home, she called out for a sign. And as she did so, all of a sudden, she slammed on the brakes. Stop sign. A young girl ran right in front of her car. If she hadn't stopped, that kid would be dead. She called out for a sign from God. But this wasn't a sign from God. This was proof to her. Proof that the distraction of God would cost lives. That the distraction of God wasn't present because there wasn't a God. And slowly, she accepted this reality. Telling him was the hardest thing that she ever had to do, but tell him she did. He was devastated. Of course he was. He believed in God and loved God, well, more than her, which she understood. It was, after all, in their cherished holy book to do that, but he was pissed. You're going to hell, he said. She said, prove it. And he set about doing just that. He came at her with scriptures, writings, and what about this book, and this author, and this philosopher, and this argument, and that? And when none of that worked, he started trying to tear apart her science, her legacy. She threatened to divorce him. Actually, she promised that she would divorce him at the end of that month. This killed her, just about. and it killed him. He realized that he was causing her pain, and he didn't want that because he loved her. And so he was outside praying at the night sky. God, please, show her you exist. Give her something. Give me a way to convince her. I don't want her to go to hell. Because that was the ultimate cost of not believing. You'd go to hell. The sin that couldn't be forgiven. He realized the Bible had said asking for signs is a sin. He was sinning by asking for a sign. If he was going to be a sinner, and she was, maybe he needed to admit to his other sin. Because when he thought about his wife and he thought about God, he realized something. He loved her more than he loved God. Because he knew he would never be able to convince her. So he went to her. She was asleep, and by now they had separate beds in separate rooms. He slowly, gently brushed her cheek. She woke up. He apologized. And he said, "Okay, I'll go to hell for you." She woke up more suddenly then. What? I can't convince you there's a God. So I'll stop believing. I'll commit the unforgivable sin. I'll join you in hell. And yeah, we'll be separated. We won't ever see each other, but we'll know that we're there. And heaven without you would be hell. So I will join you. She cried. He cried. They embraced. Although they didn't sleep together that night, it took time to repair their relationship. It had been strained the past few months. But true to his word, he stopped talking about God. He stopped going to church. He stopped writing about God. He stopped praying. He still believed in God, but he kept it in his head. Of course, all the interview places wanted to know what was going on. So he promised the one that had given him the biggest shot at the beginning of his career an exclusive interview at the end of the year. He would answer one and only one question. They agreed. The money they are offering him was substantial. He turned his attention towards painting and drawing and stories and art of what he said was completely unusual and original. No one else had ever done it. I'm going to draw and paint and write about my lover. No one's ever done that, he said. She rolled her eyes at him, laughing. Yeah, okay. And so the two continued in their relationship. As the end of the year approached, he was quite nervous. She was there for him. And he said something unusual to her. Be there for me in the studio. Normally he'd have her at home or going about her business, but he needed her there. They offered her a chair and she refused to sit, at least at first. She couldn't decide what to do with her arms. Should I fold them? Should I put them behind my back? Okay, give me a chair so I can put them on the chair. Then she crossed her legs back and forth. He's gonna notice this. But she looked at him and he was not paying attention to her. No, he was focused on where the interviewer would sit. He looked at the camera, looked back at the chair, sweat. Stood up, sat down. Do you want anything to drink? Yes. No. Yes. Water. They brought a pitcher of water in a glass. He drank from the glass, burped, coughed, sneezed. He said, "Excuse me," several times. Finally, the interviewer came, shook his hand. He calmed down. And before he knew it, the countdown to go live had begun. Now he was on, and he was in his element again. And in his mind's eye, it was as if the two of them were floating in chairs, alone in the universe, just them, able to somehow speak to each other despite the lack of oxygen. But no matter, this would be a great poem and painting later on, he thought. He shook his head, snapped him out of the dream sequence. The interviewer had finished introducing him and asked the one and only question, the one that mattered to them, to the world. Do you still believe in God? He opened his mouth, hesitated. He looked to the left. He looked to the right. He looked down and up and looked at his wife. The hairs on his arms stood up. The realization washed over him like water, a gentle breeze. What? He smiled. I did it, he said. The interviewer, breaking their own rule, said, Did what? He looked at her. He ran to her, picked her up, and swung her in a circle, laughing. I have joined you. I have committed the ultimate sin. I don't believe in God. We're both going to go to hell. And then he laughed. The cameras panned to watch him holding her, and he said into the camera, There's no God. There's no hell. What a ridiculous thing to believe in. The two ran off together. That interview was, of course, the most famous interview that station ever aired. People debated it for years to come, and his works, his words, his hidden intentions were debated. But he and her, they were together. Did they live happily ever after, you might wonder? Did they have kids? Or maybe you might be wondering, did they go to hell? These are all great questions. But perhaps the greatest question, the one that matters more, is how well his book did that he sold, entitled, Okay, I'll Go to Hell for You.